morning, everyone. It's good to be with you this morning. If we haven't met before, my name's Adam. I'm one of the pastors here at Life Anglican Church, Marsden Park. And I wonder if, like me, you've ever felt anxious when it comes to signing a contract. Because corporations can put all sorts of things into contracts that might make them scary or might make you obliged to do certain things that maybe you don't want to do. I mean, did you hear the other week that a man by the name of Jeffrey Piccolo sued the Disney Corporation over the wrongful death of his wife? They were eating at a restaurant in Disneyland, Disney World in Florida, and the restaurant ignored his wife's allergens, and as a result, she died. But the Disney lawyers tried to argue in court that the case should be thrown out because several years ago, Jeffrey had signed up for a trial of the Disney Plus streaming service. And part of the contract that he had to sign for that, tick, I've read the terms and conditions, was that any legal issue with Disney had to be settled out of court. Well, you'd be thankful to know that that defense didn't work. But all sorts of things can be snuck into contracts that oblige you to do certain things. And this makes me think, what about our contract with God? Because we do have a contract with God. And one of the terms of this contract is holiness. God requires his people to be holy in order to serve him. And this means that in order to serve God, we must be always doing the morally right thing. We must always be thinking the morally right thing. Always obeying, always doing what is good and right. But if we are honest with ourselves, we know that's not the case. I mean, I can't count the amount of times that I have ticked, yes, I have read the terms and conditions, when actually I didn't. But if we just look under the surface of our lives, if we just scratch a little bit under the surface, we will see that actually we do not meet God's standards for holiness. We all know that we've all done something or thought something, that there's something about us that means that we fall short. Deep down, we all know that we fall short of God's standards. This might cause us to think then, who do I think I am that I could be one of God's people? I'm not good enough. But as we examine the terms and conditions of our contract with God, we will actually see how wonderful it is, how good it is, that we can be his people. We can serve him, even though we've fallen short of his standards. We don't have to meet them because they've been met. That's because Hebrews 9 shows us that Jesus has secured our new covenant with God. Now, so far I've been using the word contract, but from now I'm going to be using the word covenant, because covenant is a better word. It's a better word for our agreement with God. Now, don't be frightened by the word covenant. It might sound unusual, but it kind of just means contract. There's a bit more to it, but it's helpful, I think, to think of it as like a contract. So from now on, I'm going to be using the word covenant this morning. And as Hebrews 9 shows us, Jesus secures our new covenant with God, first by cleansing our conscience. Verse 11. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, not a part of this creation. So quick background to what's being said here. You'll notice that verse 11 begins with the word but. This is showing us that the passage that was read out for us, it's actually comparing something that came before, the first 10 verses of Hebrews 9. And in those verses, we are introduced or shown something called the tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle, it's the in the Old Testament law, it's sort of the center of God's people's community of worship. It's this big tent that was set up in the middle of the Israelite camp, where everybody had almost free access to come to God equally, to worship Him, to offer sacrifices. There would be a courtyard, which most people could go to if you were an Israelite. But then there would be a room called the Holy Place, which you couldn't enter unless you were a priest. But even then, behind that was a special inner room called the Most Holy Place, which you wouldn't be able to enter unless you were the high priest. And even then, you could only enter once a year for a special sacrifice, an annual sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin. But what do we see in verse 11 about Jesus? We see Jesus is our high priest. And he's gone into the more perfect tabernacle, the heavenly tabernacle. Now, that's not saying that heaven is like a big tent, but it's saying that Jesus has gone into the very presence of God the Father himself. Because the most holy place in the tabernacle, it only ever represented God's presence. Jesus, however, he's there for real. But how did Jesus get there? Well, with the old tabernacle, under the old covenant, the high priest could only ever enter after spilling animal blood, sprinkling himself in the tabernacle to spiritually cleanse it so then he could go in. And he could only do it once a year. Jesus, on the other hand, entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. And this is exceedingly good news for us, because under the old covenant, the blood of animal sacrifice could only ever outwardly cleanse a person. But Jesus' blood is far superior, far superior. I mean, think about this. The people of ancient Israel, God's ancient people, they were warned that they could not approach God unless they had carried out the proper sacrifices for forgiveness and cleansing. If they didn't offer those sacrifices, then God would strike them down if they tried to approach him. Even the high priest, in that once a year annual sacrifice, had to have a cord wrapped around him just in case he didn't offer the sacrifices properly, just in case he didn't take the job of approaching God seriously and died as a result. The cord was there so people could pull him out. So it's no wonder then that many of us might feel concerned or worried about whether or not we can approach God. If approaching God requires such seriousness, requires such honor and reverence, it's so easy then, no wonder that we might start thinking that we're not worthy of being God's people, of approaching him and serving him. And the grim truth is actually we're not. The animal blood would spiritually cleanse someone outwardly, but it would never complete the job. It would never finish it. Something deeper was needed. It's a bit like having a termite infestation in your house. I mean, you can go about repairing the damage as much as you want, replacing a bit of the floor here, part of the wall there, maybe some of the roof or whatever the case is. But unless you get rid of the termites, the job is never done. There's always going to be a problem, and something deeper is needed. But Jesus finishes the job. Jesus' blood, his sacrifice, finishes the job. Verse 14, how much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. See how Jesus' blood is better. The animal blood would only ever outwardly clean, but Jesus' blood provides full cleansing, complete. But notice, in particular, what is cleansed. our consciences. Now, you might be thinking that this means there's no more guilt. Like maybe your conscience is cleansed, whatever's been weighing on your mind or whatever guilt you've been shouldering, it's gone now. And that's true. That is absolutely what that means. That is a wonderful reality and a wonderful result of Jesus shedding his blood for us. No more guilt. That's excellent. But there's wonderfully more to it. If you're familiar with Pinocchio, you might think of Jiminy Cricket, who helps Pinocchio by acting as his conscience. You know, he guides Pinocchio in rejecting bad choices and making good choices and doing good things by giving him advice and all this sort of thing. You see, the word conscience, as it's used in Hebrews 9, also refers to how we make decisions, how we think about making decisions about what to do. And Jesus' blood has cleansed our conscience, both our guilt, but also how we can make decisions. And so a cleansed conscience means that we are now capable of choosing to love and worship and serve God. We can please him. We can serve him. By his word, we can discern right from wrong. We can live for him. Jesus gave his blood to cleanse us completely and thoroughly. We have a cleansed conscience, no more guilt, so we can approach God. We are free to do so. But we are also now able to choose to love and honor him, to do things that please him truly. You see, Jesus has secured our new covenant with God by his blood. And as we continue reading Hebrews 9, we will see that there must be blood. Verse 15. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set us free from the sins committed under the first covenant. So what things are necessary for a contract today? Well, both parties need to agree, sign on the dotted line. Maybe if it's a particular contract between big parties and whatnot, lawyers might need to get involved to mediate to make sure things are negotiated, stuff like that. For a covenant, it's similar, but there must be blood. But why blood? I have to admit to you that I find the notion of blood being spilled quite uncomfortable. Animal sacrifice feels quite uncomfortable and unsettling to me. But when I start thinking like this, then I need to pause and remind myself of just who God is. That he is holy and righteous. That he is the one who is good. That there is no one and nothing in all of creation that is more morally superior or good to God. He is good. He is the Lord of the universe, and that sinning against him is the worst possible thing that anyone could do, no matter how big or small that sin is. It is the highest rebellion. It is high treason, and it must be paid for. It screams for justice. Sinning against him requires justice. And there must be blood. The payment is death. And so when God made his first covenant with his people after rescuing them from Egypt, blood had to be spilled in order for his people to be able to live with him safely. Blood had to be spilled. And Moses acted as the mediator. The person standing between God and his people, bringing them together in peace by blood. Moses sprinkled the people, the tabernacle, the tent where they would meet with God, and everything that they would use for worshiping God, Moses sprinkled all of it with blood, with animal blood. The animal blood, it represented the life of God's people. It represented them. Now, it wasn't actually their life. The animal would shed its blood and die on behalf of the people. The animal spilled its blood for them. It's like they were swapped out. So death was necessary in order for there to be peace between God and his people. And to further explain why death is necessary, Hebrews uses the example of a will. And like today, most wills come into effect only after someone has died. My uncle, for example, when he died recently, he left me his car. It's the one that my family and I use to get here nearly every Sunday. He left that to me in his will, but it only came into effect after he died. But however, as we have already seen, animal blood could never finish the job. It wasn't enough. And that's why under the Old Covenant, animals had to be sacrificed again and again and again and again. Once a year, as we already talked about, the high priest would offer a specific grand sacrifice involving 2 goats. One goat would be sent into the wilderness, leaving God's people, representing sin, leaving God's people. The other goat would be sacrificed. It was a special day called the Day of Atonement. But even then, this was an annual sacrifice. It had to be repeated year after year after year. It never completed the job. We also see, as Hebrew tells us, that blood was needed for forgiveness. There had to be death. Hebrews 9:22. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. And so Jesus secures our new covenant with God by his blood, because he shed his blood once. Only once. And that once did the job. It's done. Jesus' blood secures our new covenant and our forgiveness, the forgiveness of sins. Jesus even said that this is why he would shed his blood. He told it to his disciples, his followers, the night before he died. I mean, as Mark has told us today, we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. And during that supper, the Last Supper, this is what Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew 26:28. He took the cup and says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And so Jesus himself says that he is spilling his blood on the cross in order to secure our new covenant. There must be blood. Jesus gave it. He paid. And like Moses, Jesus is the mediator of our new covenant with God. He is the one who stands between us and God, bringing us together in peace. But Jesus is a greater mediator than Moses for 2 particular reasons. As we saw in verse 14, Jesus was described as without blemish. Calling to mind, if you're familiar with the Old Testament sacrifices, that the animals offered had to also be without blemish, meaning that you couldn't offer one that was blind or had a broken leg or was somehow substandard. But for Jesus to be without blemish doesn't just mean that he's physically fit, it also means that he is morally unblemished. He has no sin. And this makes Jesus far superior to Moses. But Jesus is also God himself, God in human flesh, fully God and fully man. Jesus truly mediates between us and God. He truly brings us to God in peace because he is God. And so what does this mean then for us in our new covenant with God? It means there's no fine print. There's no hidden clauses or extra obligations. There's no secret standards that we must meet in order to contribute our end of the bargain and be saved. Because Jesus has paid the blood payment. Jesus did it. It's done. You don't need to worry about being good enough. That's not a concern anymore. You don't need to worry about God going back on the deal because he's shed his blood for it. He's all in. Jesus, God in human flesh, shed his own blood for us to secure our new covenant with God. Blood was needed and Jesus gave it. This is wonderful. And so you don't need to worry about being good enough. You don't need to worry about that. You can now get on with the business of serving God. Get on with the business of loving him freely, because Jesus' sacrifice is final. Now, how we think about the freedom that we now have to serve God matters, because we do have freedom, but it's not unlimited freedom. To help me think about this, I like to think about learning to drive. I think it's a helpful analogy for the kind of freedom that we have. Because when you're learning to drive, you're on your L's, you've got to have a fully licensed driver in the car with you at all times, all right? But then, when you get your P's, you're free from that, but your speed is still limited, right? But then you go from your P's to your full license, your black license. You're free to drive by yourself at any speed, provided it's within the boundaries of the speed limits, right? Within the boundaries of the road rules. And so it is with us. We have freedom, but it is not unlimited. We are free to love and serve God without hindrance. Free to do the things that please him, to live for him. After all, like we saw before, our conscience is cleansed. So we can now make those choices to truly please and honor him. Now, this is a key part of the new covenant that Jesus has secured for us, our new covenant with God. We can truly know and please God. God even describes that this is what the new covenant is like. He describes it in the Old Testament. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 33, God says, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people." And this is the new covenant that we live in now. The old covenant is gone, and this new covenant is here because of Jesus, his sacrifice on our behalf. And Jesus' sacrifice is final. It has fully ushered in this covenant. No more animal death is needed. No more sacrifice for forgiveness is needed. Hebrews 9:25 points this out for us by saying that Jesus did not enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own, but instead he was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many. But did you notice that Hebrews 9 also points out that Jesus will come again, that he will return? I mean, every now and then, I hear somebody say that we are living in interesting times. And what they mean by that is like these days aren't normal, the days that we're living in. And they usually point to world events to say this, like the war in Ukraine and Russia at the moment, that sort of thing. Or they might point to recent events in our history, like the pandemic, for example, to say that these are interesting times. But the main thing about these days, according to Hebrews, it isn't necessarily that they're interesting, it's that they're final. That these are the final days. Look again at Hebrews 9, verse 26. It says that Jesus appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. The culmination of the ages. What's that mean? What time period is that referring to? Well, it's referring to the days that we live in now. The days between when Jesus died on the cross and rose again, and the day when he will come back, when he returns. And when Jesus comes back, he's not going to come back to bring more forgiveness of sins, because that's not necessary. That's done. Jesus has shed his blood. Instead, he's going to bring judgment and salvation. Verse 27. Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Jesus' sacrifice is final. There's no more sacrifices needed. But it is also the final sacrifice. There is no more sacrifice needed because God is bringing an end to this part of history. We are in the last days, which is why it is now so important for us to live lives that serve God. Because Jesus has paid for our sin. And we're in the last days. These are the days to serve God. These are the days when Jesus has secured our new covenant. He has cleansed our conscience. He's removed all barriers between us and God so that we can serve him fully. He's done it. So how do we actually now live lives that please and serve God? There's a lot of ways that we can do this. There's almost countless ways that we can do this. But I really want to focus on one today. And that's serving each other. Because to serve each other in love is also to serve God. He wants us to serve each other. In fact, Hebrews even brings up in the very next chapter that serving one another is what we should do because we live in the last days. Now, I won't talk too much about this because Mark is going to preach on this next week, and I don't want to steal his thunder. But in Hebrews chapter 10, we are instructed to consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds because we live in the last days. And I want to suggest that we can do that right here, right now, in our church community today. This is the place to do it. This is the community to do this with. And there is so much to do in our church community, so much that we can all get involved in. And it won't do for us to wait for the experts to fix everything or to do everything. You know, to wait for the people who are somehow good enough. Because Jesus has cleansed your conscience as well as mine. He's cleansed our consciences. So therefore, we don't have to worry about being good enough. We don't have to worry about being perfect at the job because Jesus bled for you. Jesus bled for you. If you believe in him, then you are one of the people that he has chosen to be at this church to serve, to be together, to serve each other. So let me ask, have you considered whether or not you could help out at the welcoming desk or with welcoming people to church? You don't have to be an expert welcomer to do that. Have you considered helping out with morning tea? You don't need to be an expert coffee maker to do that. I mean, have you even considered helping out with setting up the chairs or packing them down after evening church? Or on a more personal level, have you considered who you could pray with regularly, who you could encourage to keep living for Jesus, who you could be a shoulder for if somebody is going through a really rough time in their life? And as a bit of a personal interest of mine, have you considered how you might be able to serve the children and youth of our church? And I'm not just talking about officially joining the children's and youth ministry teams, although please, if you're thinking about that, come and talk to me. I'd love to chat with you. But there's plenty of ways that we can be serving even the children and youth of our church. There's a lot of work to be done. Come and chat with me. I'd love to talk with you about that. There's lots of opportunities. But the main thing I want us to avoid, the mistake that I want us to avoid, is to think that we need to be good enough. To think that we can't serve unless we are good enough. Because it's not about being good enough. It's not about being the expert. Please don't let "I don't know how to do that" stop you from trying. Because skill can be taught. Skills to serve can be taught. But what Jesus has done has cleansed your conscience. So you are free from guilt, free from shame, and free to just get on with serving God and pleasing him. You are someone that Jesus has bled for. You are someone that he has cleansed. You can serve. You can. You see, Jesus doesn't need experts. He doesn't need the expert coffee makers. He wants you. That's why he bled for you. He chose you. He chose you. You see, under the old covenant, God's people had to always worry about whether or not they were good enough. They had to constantly worry about whether they met God's righteous standards. Under the new contract, under the new covenant, all of that worry is out the window because Jesus has shed his blood for us. Jesus has cleansed our conscience. Jesus is the mediator. Jesus' sacrifice is final. And Jesus has secured our new covenant with God. And so let's pray to him freely. Kind Father, we praise you for your love for us, especially that you have shown us in Jesus. We praise you for Jesus' blood, that he shed it to bring us into the new covenant. And so, Father, help us to live lives knowing that we are free to serve you, secure in the truth that Jesus has secured the new covenant. It's not based on our performance, but based on his. And it's in his name that we pray and thank you. Amen.